The skin beneath my palm was a living furnace. Her skin simmered hot with the fever, radiating a heat that felt less like illness and more like a contained inferno. The woman's pale face was starkly accented by rosy cheeks, slicked and shining with a fine film of sweat. My hand, resting delicately on her forehead, trembled, not for weakness but from the shock of the temperature. My breath quickened, catching in my throat as the aggressive heat penetrated my palm, a searing wave that moved quickly up my arm toward my core. I wanted desperately to cry out, to snatch my hand back and recoil from the unexpected sharpness of the burning, but the cold, severe echo of Mama's scolding words instantly clamped down on the impulse. You must bear the pain. To heal means to take from the inflicted. The serpent must always stay coiled within. This warning was more than advice. It was a religious doctrine. It became my instant, silent mantra, the painful rhythm against which I held my composure. I focused on drawing the fire into myself, breathing through the shock until the woman's body beneath my hand began its slow, inevitable cooling. The final convulsive shivers left her body, and only then, when the transfer was complete, did Mama give me the reward I craved, a slow, solemn nod and a rare, fleeting smile for a job well done. "Soon you won't need me to attend to your visits," Mama murmured, her voice thin with fatigue, though her attention seemed to drift. She stared listlessly at the low-slung sun that broke through the trees, painting the forest floor in stripes of orange and shadow. The walk across the village to this secluded, failing patient had lasted through most of the day, and the immense psychic fatigue of the healing session wore heavily on me. My mind immediately, miserably traced back to the woman, not just a patient, but a subject whose misery had been my focus for some time. She was afflicted with a high fever that refused to break, and a corrosive sickness that seemed to steal her life force with each passing day. Despite the patient's obvious decline, Mama had insisted she was the perfect, vital patient for me to practice my gift on, a living laboratory for my burgeoning painful powers. It was the sight of the woman's prolonged suffering that had caused my greatest slip. I had foolishly, dangerously asked Mama one night, wouldn't it be better for her suffering to end than to keep prolonging her illness? Mama had grown furious, a sudden, terrible transformation that crackled with silent, devastating power. Her eyes, usually dull with age, had become sharp and condemning. She insisted that our sworn, sacred job was always to heal, reminding me with a terrifying vehemence that the serpent was evil and must be contained at all costs. He would do anything to trick our minds into easing suffering, to allow him to be free through the temptation of euthanasia.
It was the last she would speak of it, but the chilling glance she gave me lingered, a silent, binding vow of obedience. I knew what I must do now. Keep the woman alive, keep practicing the draining art of transference, and keep the serpent coiled within me. The question, however, that now chilled me far more than the healing heat was not if I could keep the serpent coiled, but what exactly I was keeping alive inside that woman. For a flicker, as the last of her fever left, I saw not a patient but a hollow vessel, and I realized I was prolonging not her life but the existence of whatever she was suffering for. A loud rapping at the door woke me. Mama had already donned shoes, a candle's flame flickering brightly as the door was answered. "A plague upon the village," a voice bellowed. Sounds of wild frenzy danced on the night air behind him. Joining them at the door, I peered into the darkness. Flames ran rampant as men carrying torches ran house to house. Wails echoed, babies cried. Mama's eyes widened before she took off into the crisp night air. I followed as quickly as I could, my lungs burning from the chill of the season's change as I ran towards her, towards the hysteria. "It's a fever," some screamed as they held loved ones close. Each wore a reddened face and waxen skin. Mama had already begun going door to door. A gentle hand was laid on every afflicted she could find. I reached out a trembling hand to a woman with a child, trying desperately to keep the panic inside as the child screamed in agony. A tiny hiss filled my ears, causing me to withdraw my hand in a flash. The mother looked at me helplessly. I knew I had to try again, but my mind buzzed from the frenzy. The dark cure had become known, and I refused to allow the serpent to break free. Defeated, I left them there, the child screaming and the mother sobbing. When I finally reached Mamao, she was almost across the village. "We have to check on our patient," she huffed. She hadn't even looked to see who was coming behind her. I followed in silence, my heart a drum as frantic as the chaos erupting within the village. The house was in shambles. It was our first view of what was to come. The door had been left ajar when we entered. Mamao had been calling out, trying to locate the woman and her husband. A deathly silence permeated the air, unsettling against the backdrop of the havoc we had just escaped. First came the squelching, a thick, slurping suckle that subtly broke the silence. A gnashing, oozing followed, filling the air with a nauseating sweet sickness and raw meat aroma. We knew the events unfolding before we stepped foot into the bedroom. The woman had grown feral. Her body was situated at unnatural angles, joints beginning to break free of the elastic prison, grown tightly thin. Her clothing and hair were disheveled, and the flames of Mamao's candle reflected the silky substance that clung to the sores on her face. Mamao handed me her candle, ignoring the brutalized caracas that lay on the floor at the woman's knees. I urged my mind to focus on the dancing of the flame, begging the swirl of bile that slowly crept up my throat to stay within my body. Mamao didn't say a word as she touched what could no longer be called a woman. Screams filled the air as the squeals and pops of skin and bone began to burn. The pungent odor of rot and death permeated the air as it shifted into the furling of thick, black smoke. It was over in a matter of minutes. "Mercy," Mamao whispered gently as she trudged past me. Her eyes never left the floor. An infirmary had been set up for those afflicted by the unknown plague. Mamao and I began our work, joined by the few other healers in the village. Tirelessly, we rotated between afflicted men, women, and children, bearing the weight of an unknown fever. Bones began to break. Skin began to thin, wrapping itself dangerously tight against the emaciated forms it was attached to. Sores erupted where the skin was weakest. Children cried, women wailed, men pleaded for death. Our healing wasn't working. Exhausted to our cores, we worked non-stop. Barely time to recoup our own strength before moving to the next, to lay hands, bear the pain, and continue. A fellow healer slept between those she was working on, a hand on each head as she caught a few minutes of rest. Those nearing their end were transferred to Ward 3. A step before monsters, the townspeople whispered, as the story of Mamao's mercy had spread. The other healers didn't waste their efforts on Ward 3. Too exhausted, too few results, too little, too late. I entered the ward cautiously, with Mamao close behind me. Death's scent lingered. Beyond the canvas dividers, it seeped into the wool blankets, became a rot within the wooden cots, and even turned the earth black under its stench.
"Please," a gravelly voice choked out as a skeletal hand reached for me. The man was gaunt, his eyes sunken deeply into their sockets. His bones had begun contorting, a popping that could be heard above the groans in the room. "Mercy," he barely managed to whisper, his shallow sockets pleading with the tears he could no longer shed. He gagged on his words, the loss of mucus making each syllable a dagger in his throat. My eyes flitted between the man and Mama as the bundle of fear rose in my chest. The soft hiss caresses my inner ear again. Mama nodded and left the room. How would I use the dark cure properly if she hadn't taught me? Panic seized me as I felt my lungs struggle to grasp for air. Before me, the man continued to contort, Snaps and squeals bounced around my head. Rubbery flesh tore apart, revealing the slickened white below. He howled as the snaps gave way to wet slurps that left a pattering against the cold earth. The hiss within grew louder, and in my mind's eye I envisioned the serpent, coiled deep in my core. His jet-black scales were radiant beneath the glass lid I kept him under. I watched as he slithered within his coil, moving himself into a position to strike. Envisioning the lid raising high, I watched as the serpent reached up from my core. Twirling his way down my arm, I could feel the burning cold pulsation of his power. Lying my hand upon the man allowed the serpent to strike, icy heat pouring from my hand as the man screamed and burned. My nostrils filled with rot so dense that my body was forced to retch. It was done. The serpent had slithered back to my core to wait. Mercy, I reminded myself, just as Mama had said. It was precisely what he had asked for. A trickle of electric heat flooded through me. Again, my arm trembled, but this time not from fear. An odd pleasure had erupted through me as the serpent ran his dark tear through me. It was a sensation I had never experienced when healing. Mama had returned to the ward. She found me weary, still fruitlessly laying hands on the afflicted. These people are dying. I wasn't even sure I said the words out loud. My eyes drooped wearily. We must not give in to the serpent, she said, laying my head on her shoulder, brushing the matted tangles off my face. To use him is to lose your soul. I'd heard the stories before. Healers, too, lost due to feeding the dark cure. The throngs of power mixed with pleasure that only the darkness could give. I had touched that power, let it enter a place within me that I wasn't even sure the healing light could remove. Even after being contained, it still rubbed like satin against my skin.
A tango of dark and light took hold of my thoughts. What about Mercy? I should have never let you do that. Disappointment filled her eyes. She straightened her smock before leaving the room. Alone with the dying and no further guidance from Mama, fatigue began taking ownership, a step before monsters. This serpent hissed in my ear. Heaviness grew in my chest. That's what these people were to become. A room filled with skeletons, popping, snapping, gurgling. Could they even still be called a person? Mercy. The word rumbled through my head, fueled by the fires of exhaustion. My eyes stung from the strain of fighting to keep them open. Torch flames bounced off the walls, their light bringing tears to my eyes. My muscles groaned as I forced a step, then another. I had to leave the ward. If I lost myself to the serpent, I would be just as much of a monster as the afflicted. Inside, the serpent slithered. His soft hiss was growing steadily into a murmur. Mercy. With each step, I could feel him growing. A steady pressure formed behind my eyes as he echoed his singular chant. Mercy. No, I shouted to the night. Wrapping my arms tight against my chest, I begged my mind to still. The memory of the man welled in my eyes. My throat tightened, restricting air enough to make my words raspy. I can't be that. Would you rather they all be monsters instead? The serpent's words faded into the images of the woman and her husband, the nauseating smell of the sweet liquid spilling across her floor, the squelching suckles as she drained the man she once loved. Blood and bone and carnage that awaited each person in this room. Mercy. Thoughts grew so loud I could no longer untangle their origin. Caring for so many left the sensation of lead flowing through my veins. I scanned the room for the bodies that were nothing more than cocoons of their following form. Ward 3, the forgotten ward, the one where people go to die. I shook my head at the thought, the voices inside urging a correction, the one where they go to become monsters. Tears flowed heavily, staining my cheeks. Row by row I went, touching each figure as I passed. Screams ignited, flames set the room ablaze. Sizzles, pops, lurches, and squeals erupted, a cacophony of sickening, dismal sounds that faded rapidly into ash. Mama and the other healers rushed to the room. Their faces waned in pallor at the sight before them. The remnants of the room lay in ruin. Shreds of fabric clung to charred wooden beams. Blackened frames surrounded piles of ash, darker than coal. I was busy admiring the streaks of black scales that adorned my skin.
"What have you done?" Mama's voice shook in terror. I was still vibrating from the euphoria. Mercy. The euphoria was a shock of ice water after the fever of exhaustion. It wasn't the relief of a heavy task completed, it was the sheer, breathtaking power of the act itself. The black scales that patterned my forearms were exquisite, thin, seamless obsidian that shimmered in the residual heat. They weren't a curse, they were an upgrade. Mamo and the 3 remaining healers stood frozen at the doorway, their mouths agape at the destruction. The air was thick with the scent of burnt meat and ozone. I looked at the piles of ash, then at my hands, feeling the strength coiled within my limbs, no longer leaden, but sharp and vital. "Mercy," I repeated, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. It was the only answer that made sense. I had saved them from a fate worse than death. But Mama's fear was not for the dead, it was for the living. "The fire," Mama gasped, taking a stumbling step back. That was not the serpent's doing. You have not been initiated. How did you command the fire?" Her words struck me like a tuning fork, bringing my chaotic thoughts into sharp, immediate focus. The serpent, the voice in my head, the creeping influence that had whispered its way into my deepest fears. The serpent wasn't the source of the power. It was a symptom, a psychic echo of the affliction. The serpent was what the victims heard just before the final, consuming transformation. But I hadn't transformed. I had used the serpent's energy, channeling the agony of the soon-to-be monsters through my own being and releasing it as purifying flame. I looked at the blackened doorway, then back at Mamo. "The serpent only hissed," I explained, the words now calm and precise, completely devoid of the exhaustion that had nearly crippled me minutes before. It only gave me the word, mercy. I provided the method. I walked toward the doorway, stepping lightly around the charcoal remains of Ward 3. The healers recoiled, parting like water. "Your father," Mama stammered, her eyes darting to my now healed scaled arms. "He was afflicted, and he contained the infection. He gave himself to the deep well to keep the seed dormant." My father hadn't abandoned me or died of a normal illness. He had been the original guardian of the affliction, sacrificing his mind and body to suppress the very thing that made me capable of this destruction. And Mama knew. Her disappointed look earlier was not about my question of mercy. It was about the fact that I had awakened the power he had died trying to keep dormant. "And you have been nurturing the afflicted," I countered, stopping directly in front of her. "Not to heal them, but to harvest them, to watch their final transformation and then what? Contain the power? Use the raw energy of the change?" Mama's composure finally broke. "The change provides the fuel. The blood fire can only be controlled by those who have touched the edge of the serpent's call and rejected it. It is the only thing that keeps the other wards safe." I understood now. Ward 3 wasn't the forgotten ward. It was the boiler room. The suffering in that room, the final surge of agonizing transformation, was being consciously cultivated by Mama and her healers to generate the energy required for their arcane protections against the wider spread of the plague. They were not healers, but desperate pragmatic alchemists, feeding the engine of their defense with human suffering. My act of mercy, my final violent no to the serpent, hadn't just saved the dying, it had just blown up their power source. I smiled at Mama, the the candlelight reflecting in my now golden eyes, and stepped out of the burning ward and into the rest of the facility, feeling the cold, empty space where the enormous energy of Ward 3 used to be. The other wards were now utterly unprotected. "Well," I said, tilting my head, admiring the way the scale on my knuckles caught the light, "I guess you'll need a new power source then. What about me?"